Welcome to the Opportunity Podcast, where entrepreneurs come to learn from real buyers, sellers, and industry experts on the lesser-known growth opportunities to build their online business empires. We'll uncover tactics veteran online business entrepreneurs have used to build, buy, flip, and sell their way towards personal wealth. Sit back, grab a coffee, and get ready to uncover hidden growth secrets. The Opportunity Podcast starts now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Opportunity. Today, I am talking to Marvin Liao. Marvin is a super cool dude. He works in VC. He's invested in I thought it was 400, but I guess it's over 452 pre-seed and seed startups. So I met Marvin back in Beverly Hills a few weeks ago at an event, and I just loved what he had to say. He was very reasonable. He was logical, funny dude, and just knew what he was talking about. And similar to me, he has also been in about 7 time zones in the last month. So he and I commiserate a little bit on the ironic, incestuous nature of a lot of SaaS conferences, and we go deep on how founders can build something big. So if that sounds interesting to you, check out this episode. And if you like it, Marvin said he'd come back for another episode. So let us know, leave us a review, leave us a comment, or shoot me a message. And of course, shoot Marvin a message on LinkedIn. Details at the end. Talk to you soon. All right, I have Marvin with me, and we were just talking off of the podcast, and I literally started shouting Marvin's name, like, stop, let's talk about this on the actual podcast, because I think this is really interesting. So a recap for the audience, privy to our offline conversation. Marvin and I have been traveling a lot these past month or so.
Way too much.
Way too much. So before I recap this, Marvin, how about you introduce yourself just real quick? Tell us what you do and where you are at in the world right now.
All right, sure. Thank you. Great for having me. My name is Marvin. I've been in Silicon Valley now for about 22 years. So did sort of the startup thing, did sort of the big tech thing. I was a big tech executive at Yahoo doing international expansion for over a decade. Then I was a VC at a fund called 500 Startups. So I ran the Core Accelerator program and helped run Fund 3 and Fund 4 over there. I left end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And now I do my own thing. I have my own angel fund. I basically sit on a bunch of investment committees of different VC funds. I also have a small VC fund as well, too, investing in early stage pre-seed founders. And I'm based in San Francisco, but I travel a crap ton. And that's kind of how Greg and I know each other, and also being on the conference circuit.
Yeah, you and I were commiserating just before we got into this podcast of how much we've traveled in the last month. So I feel your pain, man. But I did want to keep the conversation going, what we were talking about. So as a recap, we were talking about me going to Inbound and HubSpot, and my general thesis of like seeing all these giant, relatively big enterprise SaaS companies. And I felt like it was just software companies selling to software companies that sell to software companies is, like you said, very incestuous. And a lot of times their marketing is just like,
they kind of copy each other. And what is interesting is that I actually think, as we were discussing, is that I think a lot of startups take the wrong lesson, where it's like, they'll be like, hey, what is HubSpot doing? What is like Salesforce doing? Let's just copy their website. And I'm like, the trick and the hack is actually go and take a look at, use like the Wayback Machine and go take a look at sort of like their websites like back in the day, right? So take a look at Salesforce back in 2003, 2004. Like, I'm pretty sure I recall like it not being this like bland, like I think they can get away with it because they've been around, they built their brand sort of like brand presence for the last like 20 plus years. And so everyone knows what Salesforce does. But if you're an early stage startup, you can't assume that you have the brand resonance like a Salesforce. Like you build it one customer segment at a time, right? One value proposition at a time. And so what you need to do is that you need to be super focused and super honed. Like the Wayback Machine is awesome because you take a look at what some of these companies were, how they position themselves in the early days, very, very different, right? And so I think the startups kind of draw the wrong lesson from what is seen now, if that makes sense, Greg.
absolutely, man. I've talked to people. So we started a YouTube channel not too long ago, about a little bit over a year ago, I think, maybe a year and a half. We get like some views. It's nothing explosive, but it makes us money because what we talk about. And our niche is like a niche within a niche, successful digital entrepreneur or digital entrepreneurs who are actually running successful businesses that want to sell their business, right? So it's like a super niche down, the most jaded people in the world because they see all the marketing. I've had friends that are like, well, this channel doesn't seem like it's taking off very much. But I often say, well, look at HubSpot's channel. One of their channels has over 200,000 subscribers and their average video count is 2,000 views, right?
Yeah.
like
Yeah, but they've been around a lot longer. And I also think sort of like I said, it should be quality over quantity, right? When you think about it, I think too many people get stuck in this whole quantity thing. And I also think it's time and sequencing where you're an early stage company, like it's actually quality over quantity, right? And the more specific you are, the more likely you're going to attract that niche audience. And then you expand based on that niche and segment over time.
100%. We're so already derailed from the normal questions I was going to ask you, but this is great. There is a thing I talk about. So my background is SEO and content
Yeah.
marketing, not so much
Yep.
social, but mainly search. But I
Mhm.
often always bucket content into three categories. Like priority one is like your bottom of funnel content, and
Yep.
priority three is like super top of funnel. And I feel like most people who start a business, they're thinking only top of funnel all the time because hey, it has search volume or whatever, and bottom of funnel only has like 0 searches per month, but they don't realize like those 0 searches per month, there's actual searches behind that. The tools are lying to you. Like the traffic that's coming in, they are hot. They have high
Yep.
intent. And I often use HubSpot as an example, actually, because they have an example of priority three top of funnel content. I always link to the HubSpot review article about the best Bluetooth headphones for salespeople because they used to rank for best Bluetooth headphones. Like this is a great example of top of funnel. Like the chances of someone converting on this.
So brilliant, right? Of just like they're the masters of like online marketing. They're so smart. They even bought the hustle, if I recall correctly,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Because of just the audience. Like it's so smart of just like owning your own media, right? That's sort of the future. And I wish more companies, I think companies are getting it now, partly ever since sort of like the Apple apocalypse of just like what the changes they made on sort of the Apple App Store, just how much it destroyed so many businesses, right? Particularly like the paid advertising business. It's just wrecked, right? It's completely wrecked.
It's so fascinating to me being a more creative marketer at heart, more so than like the technical data guy. When the Apple rolled out the death of cookies, basically, I felt like this is the death of the day trader marketer who is really good at like, I'm
Oh,
going to run an
absolutely.
ad at $30,000 a day between 4 p.m. and 4:05 p.m. on a Wednesday, right? Like stuff like that, I think is go away, and the creative is starting to reign supreme again. That's my prediction, at least. I don't think we're there yet, but I do think that is the future.
I'd agree with that view. It is interesting. So, last 2 years, I was on the board and was basically running a gaming holding company. And I saw sort of like the hit that all our games, and also we basically had this like social network called Plink that was generating quite a lot of money. We saw our sales, basically, our monthly sales actually get halved when that change happened. Like, just that wrecked us. It took us about 6 months to recover. And so, it just like, that was a big lesson. I remember going and asking our mutual friend, Eric Sue, I was just like, dude, what's that? Like, any tips and thoughts? He's like, yeah, go buy your own media, like go find like websites or like I'm just like this is back in like 2021, right? So like last year. And so I was like, yeah, you're totally right. Like it makes sense that sort of like HubSpot was going this direction of buying like the hustle and things or building your own, right? Like I actually think like every entrepreneur, every software company like needs to own their own media, right? Like doing content marketing like right in the sense of it's not so much content marketing, it's just like do content well. Like I actually think of content marketing and just do content well.
Yeah. And I feel like that's the way things are going to, especially in things with longer sales cycles where like
Yes.
you don't need to download a white paper to know if you're going to buy HubSpot or whatever anymore. Like you want to know more about content marketing, not to be sold to. So I do think that things are gravitating towards that, where you just make really, really good content. People are like, hey, that was awesome. I'm going to come back when I'm ready to buy something from you. Right.
Yeah, absolutely right. Like it's your marketing's changed so much. And as you know, just a bit about my background too, like I'm originally from Canada and Canada is not a very highly advanced sort of like marketing society. I call it marketing society. You come to the US, they're just like, this is why Americans are so good at the marketing. We're oversold to, we're over marketed to, and we can tell BS very, very quickly. And so the best marketers are here, right? Because like you have to sort of like go through all the foundational things and understand these basics of like copywriting. Like I tell anybody, like one of the things that I'm a young kid, and I'm just like, wow, like as long as she learns like copywriting, like the basics of copywriting, she's gonna be fine. Like she can do whatever, right? If you think about sort of wants to be sort of a white collar professional, whether she wants to sort of actually go into business, whatever the thing is that she wants to do, like the basics of copywriting, like these laws don't change. You can use it for everything and anything.
You are singing my language, man. I think the four horsemen of highly paid skills is marketing, which is mostly copywriting because the platforms
Yep.
change, but like you said, copywriting stays the same, sales, coding, and then the ultimate king, of course, being delegation. I think that is the most powerful one once you get going. Like once you hit product market fit and you have some money to actually be able to delegate. But I think copywriting is the most undervalued and overvalued skill at the same time. Because some copywriters are selling themselves for way too much for what their
Yeah.
results have used. But if you get a really good copywriter, it's insane what you can do.
They're literally worth their weight in gold. I would say in general, where it's like I think it's like delegation slash project management of just like that's really, really important, right? Like you need to be able, as you manage your own projects and manage your own businesses, it's project management. I do think that's important. I would push back on the coding thing. I think it's helpful to understand coding, but my view, not just as an investor, but just when you look at the trends of technology or whatever, like technology ends up becoming easier and easier to use. So when I think about sort of like low code versus no code, I actually think the distribution part's way more important. So sales marketing is way more important than the coding. Like I know that's sort of heresy here in Silicon Valley, but I do think think of all the tools that are showing up, right? Like I think back of sort of the analogy I use is sort of like my first company I was at. I was a very, very early employee at an e-commerce startup. Like we spent millions of dollars like building this like e-commerce website. And now fast forward like over 20 years now, like you go to things like Shopify, that's like $50 a month with like capabilities that are like 10 to 20x capabilities of what we had. And so technology over time, as you start to see low code and no code, yes, technology being a coder is going to be helpful. It's good to understand these things. Like I've taken classes, but like the reality is just like all this stuff is just becoming more abstracted to the back, right? And so you're seeing these tools and UX become easier and easier to use. And so I don't know if that's going to be a critical path to sort of career. I think it's good to understand how these technology works and how coding works. But I actually think like going forward, like my daughter, she's 13 now, like 7 years from now, I don't think she's going to need to know coding. She's taken the coding classes, but it's just like there's going to be all these tools that she's going to be able to build things without coding, right?
Right. When I say the four horsemen, so first off, I 100% agree with you. I think out of those four horsemen, coding is actually the weakest. It's still important now, but I do think you're right. I think things are transforming to where, like the no code movement, you can rebuild a Quora or a Facebook in an afternoon if you understand how bubble
Yeah.
data works, right?
Oh, totally. I mean, there's a great article I'd point you to. It's like, I couldn't remember who wrote it. It was in Wired. It's like, programmers are the new coal miners. It came out like many, many years ago. You read it, you're like, when you first title, you're like, what? It's so clickbaity. But as you read into it, you're like, oh, like, yeah, actually, it kind of is, right? Like, there used to be way more coal miners. And think what technology and automation has done. It's like, it can, same thing could happen to programmers. Like, you think about how many sort of like 50-year-old programmers there are in Silicon Valley that are totally unemployed and unemployable. Like there's a lot of them because like they just weren't able to keep up with like the new programming languages, and the programming languages they learned are kind of irrelevant now. So there's probably some lesson to that.
Have you seen this trend? So our mutual friend Eric, and I believe you're also friends with Patel. So Eric Suino Patel, that's where we met at the Beverly Hills
Mhm.
event. I was talking to Neil, and I've noticed him doing this. I've seen a few other people do it. I think Eric is doing it too with his software. But Neil will just buy software companies and effectively use them as lead magnets for his agency. like
Super
the most
smart.
expensive lead magnet in the world.
Yeah, so smart. But I also think like it is interesting too what I see sort of what I call like micro PE, right? Like micro private equity. Like I had this friend, and not going to mention his name, like he was so far ahead of everything. Like when you meet like someone who's like 15, 20 years younger than you are, and every time you talk to him, like, what have I done wrong in my life? Like, how's this person like so far, like literally so bleeding edge ahead of everything else? This was back in 2015. He came to me when I was at 500 startups and I was doing the VC stuff. And he's like, hey, do you have any, like, I'm doing this like micro, he did well, he had a bunch of exits. And he's like, I'm just doing this like micro PE thing where his goal is just to buy up failing software companies that have like interesting technology, like failing and successful, and just like roll them up, right? And he's built this like massive email list of customers that are all in like SEO, SEM space. And so he's buying up all these companies that are like relevant to SEO, SEM, and just like selling like basically because he has his email list, he goes and buys these companies and starts like basically hits up this email list like, hey, I have this new product now. And it's just like, it's so smart. He's done really, really well with that.
You were reminding me of a story. It's unrelated to software, but it is, well, kind of. It's related to email newsletters, at least, which is a software that uses. But I met this guy a few years ago. He had built an email list. I think it was like 830,000 people. And it was all from this news website that he'd never even ran. He bought it and it was still getting like insane amount of traffic. And he just built a newsletter around it. He hasn't updated it in years. And he just sends out like an affiliate offer or a product that he himself sources that audience would like every other month.
So smart.
That's the business. And it's a seven-figure business. We've looked at it because he was thinking about selling it with us. He ultimately ended up keeping it, but it's amazing the type of stuff you can do there. Let's backtrack here a little bit to more of your story. I'm getting lost in this like awesome conversation. I'm definitely
This is fun. This stuff's fun. This is the fun stuff, right?
I love it. Tell me your background. So how did you go from where you are today? Like, where did you come from? You said you worked in an e-commerce business back, was that in the early 2000s?
Yeah, so 99. Yeah, so I moved to San Francisco January 3rd, 1999. And this is during the first dot-com boom. And so I worked at a PR firm and I was so bad, they fired me on my birthday pretty much, right? And then I randomly, yeah, it's just a true story. And I was like, oh, I thought I was getting a birthday cake and I got like a pink slip, but it's fine. I was terrible at it. And that was, in retrospect, was wonderful. I ended up applying randomly for this company. It's called Libris. It's an e-commerce company, sold used and out-of-print books. And I was their first marketing hire. So I was employee number 15 or 18 is one of those. And we had just raised $12 million. The company ended up raising close to $63 million over the next like 2 years. And so I was there and I saw this company grow from about 15 to 18 people to 150 people in like 6 months. It was interesting. So I ran all the online marketing for them and learned like the SEO, SEM stuff, the digital ads. Like this is where I learned the business and did that for about 2 years. And of course, like everybody got laid off in 2001. And then I lucked out. I ended up joining Yahoo, which was like less than 3,000 people at that time. And so original plan was like go there, work for 3 months and go to business school, and end up staying for 10 and a half years and rose through the ranks. And so I ended up running a big chunk of the EMEA region. I ran most of the EMEA region for my last 2 years there. And after that, I left. I was very fortunate, done well there. So I left and basically took 2 years off. I took 2 years off as a sabbatical. And I ended up mentoring and doing a lot of sort of like angel investing and a bunch of boards, observatory boards. But I ended up mentoring at a lot of different startup accelerators. And one of them was 500 startups. And they liked me. And I guess they felt guilty for all the time I spent over there. So I started the San Francisco office for them in 2014. I worked there for 6 years and did a lot of investments there. So I did, I think, 414 pre-seed and seed stage investments in the 6 years I was over at 500. And after that, I kind of left and kind of sort of opened up my own shop, right? Learned the trade and decided to do it myself. So that's kind of how I got here.
Appropriate term, what you do, like capital allocator as your own private equity firm?
Yeah, so I did a bunch of different things. So what I do now is I have a small pre-seed fund called Diaspora. It's what they call like a rolling fund. I run that with my partner, Carlos Diaz, and we invest in pre-seed early stage founders coming to the US market. And then I also have an angel fund that I'm flipping into a larger fund right now. I run that with a buddy of mine from Saudi Arabia. So it's basically sort of like our money and friends and family money. And we've done probably now close to $6 million of deals in the last year. And so we're flipping that into a fund now where we realize like, hey, actually, we could probably do more with this and probably invest more based on sort of our deal flow and things. And that's kind of the main thing I spend my time on. These are the two things I spend most of my time on. I just recently left the gaming holding company. That was taking up a bunch of my time, but I left basically in beginning of September.
What a crazy story. That is so cool. Your story reminds me a bit of the thing I saw earlier. It was like a few weeks ago. I was talking about like how skills stack onto each other. Like,
yeah, totally. I'm Forrest Gump, right? I'm Forrest Gump of Silicon Valley. Like there was no sort of like career path of like, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to be a VC layer. Like, no, like I totally fell into it, right? Like total luck with some hard work, right? But also I think it's helpful being here in San Francisco. Like everyone bags on SF and yes, it's a dystopian science fiction nightmare and it's poorly run. It's pretty much like the most expensive third world city, right? Like on the planet, but like it's still kind of where tech is centered.
I don't think I told you the story because we didn't have a chance to really talk after Beverly Hills, but I was in San Francisco for SaaStr, right? And I was looking for like a cheap hotel to like save money. I found this one, I'm forgetting the name of it now, but
in the Tenderloin, awful. Oh,
It wasn't the Tenderloin, as it turns out. And we're driving through, the Uber's driving through. And I always forget that I'm like getting an Uber Black or something. So it's like this beautiful Escalade driving through these like foggy, steam covered roads. Like there's all these people like walking around staring at the car. We like get to the hotel and there is no hotel. It's just a brick wall. There's no
Yeah.
entrance to this. Like, what? And the Uber guy is like, "Hey man, I'm not here to tell you like what you should do, but you should probably not get out of this car." It's just like all these people, like there's like people on the streets who are just kind of like vibrating on some sort of like drug, they're shuffling around.
Yeah, Tenderloin's bad. And it's right in the
Like,
center of the
you're
city.
probably right. This hotel seems like a trap to me.
Yeah, it's bad. But at the same time, it's still the center. Like, unfortunately, sort of people's view of SF is sort of like the downtown Soma area, which is a total dump. And so SF is a fairly large area. If you go to a lot of areas like Pacific Heights and Marina and West Portal, where I am, like it's a nice neighborhood, right? And so because all the offices are closed, everyone's working from home or working from cafes in their commercial areas. Like my commercial area is very vibrant. And if you go down to sort of like you walk around Pacific Heights, like it's still the center. And so I tell people, it's like, look, I'm happy to give you career advice, but like I'm probably the worst person because like there was a huge element of luck. And also my strategy works really well in places like San Francisco, it works really well in places like LA, it works very well in places like New York, which are like real centers of tech, right? And so you can get away with my kind of like no brain, real, like no strategy, sort of like career strategy. And I really I feel very lucky, right? Like I fell into these things. I worked hard, but I also fell into these roles because I'm here, right? Like where there's just a lot of activity and a lot of opportunities.
Switching gears here a little bit to people who are earlier on in their career, like an early stage SaaS founder. I'm very curious what you think on this with your experience. So, in your view, like what areas should a SaaS founder, like early stage, spend their resources and time on? And I want to put a caveat there because I know a lot of SaaS founders, they are spending all their time in the early days just trying to get funding. Do you think like funding?
Bootstrap. I think funding is a really, really bad idea. I actually think bootstrapping gives you so much more. It's harder. Like, look, they're hard in different ways. And I actually think it depends on the type of business you're building. And this is ironic coming from VC, but I think the default of like going and raising VC money is dumb. I actually think you're better off bootstrapping and then raise later on. I think as you get traction, I think as you sort of like have a better sense of what you're building and who you're targeting, that's a time that you raise. Because I think too many times, like I meet these founders and I'm like, I'm asking a bunch of questions that you don't even have answers to. And that's just really bad, where you're probably better off going and bootstrapping and talking to as many sort of like potential customers and users as possible, and then building on top of that and just being super, super scrappy. I find that bootstrap founders are just better at running businesses in general. I think that money is a crutch. And I think there's a blog post I write. And one of the things they're just like Silicon Valley companies are like the worst companies to model yourself off of just like this idea of just like, oh, you should model yourself off Google. And I'm like, that's terrible. Like Google, and you go down the list of all the FANGs, almost all of them are so poorly managed. And everyone thinks like, oh, well, like they're great businesses because like they're great management. Like, no, they're great businesses because they have amazing business models that basically make up for the fact that they're just completely dysfunctionally managed companies.
Sometimes encounter entrepreneurs in my career, which is more of the micro PE area,
Yeah.
right? But they'll say something grandiose, like I'm going to be the Facebook of e-commerce, or something like that. Like, so you're going to have no customer service and everyone's going to hate you. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think you are making enough money to allow yourself to do that.
Yeah, like they conflate the two things, right? Like they're great businesses because they have great business models, not because their customer service is terrible, their management's terrible. Like, oh my God, like the amount of fat at places like Facebook and Google, they could fire 40-50% of the staff there and not have any effect on the business, frankly.
100%. You mentioned bootstrapping is better, and I agree with you for the most part. I'm curious on what you think on this. So, and I don't know if this is true, so correct me if I'm wrong. You have much more experience
Yeah.
here, but it does feel to me that there is a bit of almost like a FOMO that if I don't get funding and if I build something profitable, now the VCs and PE are going to look down on me versus if I sell them a vision and a dream, I'm going to get a way better valuation. But once I have real numbers, I feel like some founders feel like the opportunity is over. What are your thoughts on that? Have you seen this play out?
I understand sort of where your view is coming from. And I think that is unfortunately sort of like the perspective. And this is sort of like the outsized influence that Silicon Valley has. and I think wrong, sort of like wrongly, like this idea of just sort of like, I actually think like the truth is somewhere in between, right? Like you still need the grandiose vision, but having bootstrapped it, you own more of the company. You actually have proven out a lot more things. You just can't afford to dick around. And I see this all the time where I have lots of companies who raise money, like lots of money, raise it from amazing investors and still fail because like the money becomes a crutch, right? And so I do think you get to business basics. You figure out a lot of the business basics faster when you don't have a lot of money. The lack of money, that constraint is actually very powerful. It forces you to not waste time. And I think, unfortunately, when you do raise money, like, yes, you can grow faster. That's definitely true. You can hire people, you can do more things. That's great. But you also become very unfocused very quickly. And this is what I see that tends to happen is that what ends up happening is that they use that money to basically hide away from the truth sometimes, right? Like the product sucks. So you know what? To make my numbers look better, I'm just basically going to go and like spend more money on customer acquisition. You've seen that before, right? Like all the time here, where it's like, well, this makes me look good in front of my investors, even though I should be fixing a lot of the core issues, even though I'm not growing. You can manufacture growth. And this is unfortunately what a lot of founders actually do when they should actually be biting the bullet and fixing the product, right? But that's harder to do.
100%. I think you were seeing a lot of that too. Like the big DDC darlings are falling over themselves right now.
Oh, yeah.
And even the FBA aggregators to probably a little bit lesser extent, but still they're stumbling. This is a perfect example where you're just talking about. So I have a friend, he just became the CMO of a Web3 company. I won't name
Yeah.
their names, but
Yeah.
these entrepreneurs, extremely brilliant, but they don't know anything about marketing and the business fundamentals of their own business. Like they can barely explain it to my friend who's marketing it for them. So he has to figure through that. But they got offered by a random PR company, pay $50,000 a month, we'll get you like on TechCrunch and a few tweets, all this type of stuff. And they were seriously considering it. These people don't even have a CRM. They don't even have email marketing. They don't even have a website that a non-developer can publish a blog post on. Like they have like nothing to like accept any kind of notice that they get from this, but they're willing to spend that 50K. And I think it's because they raised so much money that it feels like, oh, I have $3 million today. We're good forever. Like $3 million can go by really, really quickly.
Yeah. And what ends up happening is you have this money, so you can throw money at the problems when, frankly speaking, it's sort of sometimes stepping back and rethinking everything, right? Or just like really biting the bullet and just like, okay, we actually have to fix this because it's one of those things. If we don't fix this, we're going to die. What ends up happening when you have too much money is like, yeah, kick it off. You kick off the hard questions, you kick off the hard decisions. And that's what tends to happen. You kick off the bad hires, right? Where it's like, let's give them another 6 months. We have the cash, right? Versus sort of like, there's this great term I learned. I'm not a Falconer, but it's like YARK, right? It's like YARAK. And so fundraising, I spend a lot of time with my companies thinking through, so like, what is the optimal number? And so this term of YARK is like, it's falconing. So for example, you have a falcon, like use them for hunting. Like I said, it's an analogy, but the point is like, when you starve a falcon too much, like they don't have the strength to basically hunt, but you give them too much food, right? Then they basically like, they're just not hungry. And so YARK is that perfect point of just like hungry enough that they're still sort of like willing to hunt, but not so full that they're sort of like, they don't have the capacity to want to chase, but they have the energy to still hunt. And so it's that perfect point, right? And I actually think you're more likely to hit YARK as a bootstrap company and sort of make those hard decisions versus, say, for example, a VC company. They end up pushing a lot of hard decisions longer. And so it takes them longer to get to YARK. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes 100% sense. I would argue even a lot of times bootstrap companies push and kick the can of those hard decisions down the road because they don't want to do it, right? They don't want to make that hard decision. And that ultimately starts cracking their business apart, if not by 1,000 different cuts. It might be tiny cuts here and there, but they're on the long downward spiral now, unless they really change themselves. I've seen that happen in bootstrap companies a lot, in my perspective. But I agree with you. I think bootstrap companies are probably more likely to make the harder decisions because they don't have the cushion, right? They don't have the safety net.
They literally don't have the cushion, right? And so if you're making decisions that don't move the dial, you cut it very quickly. That's not the case with like VC funded companies. And I'm generalizing, obviously, but just like they're able to kick the can down the road. It's like, oh, we'll try this a little bit longer, right? And like I have lots of companies that have raised quite a lot of money that end up dying because I just say they just were able to kick the can down the road. I'm just like, you sit there and you're like, what? Like it's been 2 years and you haven't launched a product yet? Like that's just shocking to me.
I think that is one of the funniest things is the person who's just obsessed and they actually do launch after the 2 years and they realize there was no point to their obsession because they have to redo the product like a bajillion times because they're not product market fit. They could have launched it in 2 months and gotten more data in like 4 months than that whole 2 years building.
Lean startup works, man.
So here's a question. Also, in my notes, like the vast majority of questions we're
Yeah.
having discussion on right now. But when someone says data driven, like I get what they're saying. Like they're being informed by the data, thus their decisions are more trustworthy, all that stuff. But I feel like if you are too data driven, especially early on, that can be like the blind leading the blind. Because, like, yes,
hmm
they like the color blue, but hey, maybe you should do this big creative campaign that's going to explode your business over here instead of like messing around with the font colors. Like, obviously, that's an extreme
Yeah.
example, but how do you balance like data driven decisions versus more creative gut
Yeah.
decisions as a early stage founder?
Here's how I think about this is I think it comes down to data sample set and the type of data that you bring in, right? So I tell people where it's like there's quantitative versus sort of like qualitative. You need both, right? So for example, like the qualitative is like sitting down and having those like interviews and discussions with like their users and customers, and that's like anywhere between like 50 to 100, right? The more the better. And it's the same thing of just like, so you learn the sort of like why they're doing things, and then you're trying to understand sort of the underlying motivations. And then you kind of take a look at the quantitative, which is whether it's the survey, so it's like the large data sample set, and then also sort of like what they're actually doing, right? Do they actually sign up for your product? Do they sign up for the wait list? How they engage with the product and tracking the funnels? You kind of have to look at both, right? And then you almost have to think about sort of like AI, right? AI, your algorithm is only as good as sort of the data that you have in. So by looking at a lot of this data, you're looking for a lot of patterns, right? It's just like stuff that shows up over and over and over and over again. And also very, very large data sample set. So basically you can develop your gut instinct, right? Like I think gut is helpful. I think my gut now at 48 is way better than it was at 20 because I didn't have a data samples. I didn't know anything. And now sort of like the more companies you invest in, the more companies you interact with, you're like, oh, well, my gut based on looking at this data and talking with you seems to point to this direction. And so your gut gets better over time, right? With more data. And so that's kind of my framework where it's like, as an early stage startup, it's like you're trying to develop your data samples, like talk to as many different people, do the surveys, go do the track like these funnels and see sort of like and look at as much of this as possible. And that's how you're going to sort of like develop your sort of like the creative part of like, oh, this is logical. We should be doing this based on these things.
That makes total sense. And I agree with you there. So you mentioned before that pricing is often wrong with SaaS founders. So talk to me about that a little bit. Why are SaaS founders often not thinking about this? And why is pricing so important in terms of the growth of the business in your view?
So pricing is signaling, right? And so one of the things of just like there's several reasons. Pricing is signaling of just sort of like the type of business. Are you more of a premium? Like if you think about retail, right? Like what you get at Walmart is going to be very, very different than what you get at the Bloomingdale's, right? And for obvious reasons, because like there's a pricing signaling aspect of it, right? Like an Apple computer is very different than a random PC computer. And so they tend to be way more expensive at Apple versus other sort of computers, as an example, right? Like not a great example. And so it's no different than when it comes to software. And I also think about software where it's like the margin aspect of it. The better margin that you have, the more you can actually spend on customer acquisition, the more you can spend on customer service. Ends up happening is that a lot of startup founders, you have this vision and dream of what your product could be. And so it's still a long ways away. And so what ends up happening is you underprice because you're like, well, I have this dream of what my product should be. But then my view is like, look, if you're solving 80, 90% of the problem of the customer right now, you should charge appropriately because you will build in over time. And so for them, they go, I have this grand dream of what this product should be. And we're like 10% there. So I shouldn't be charging the 100%. And I'm like, my view is like, no, you should actually be pricing way more high, like a lot higher, because this is how you position yourself, number one. And on top of it, you're going to be building into it. Like SaaS products, you build in way more features and functionality over time. So you will build into it. But I think because they have this view where it's like, well, my product's just not there yet, so I'm guilty for charging. I'm like, no, if you're solving their problem, you should charge appropriately. And I think it's a psychological thing. That's my view, number one. Number two, they don't have the proper framework to look at it, where I actually think like this framework is a very, very quick framework where it's like, look at what your cost plus is, right? Calculate sort of what your margin should be based on your engineering time, other things that your AWS, like cost structure. And then the other thing is like compare yourself to sort of the closest competitors and go and make sure you're not overpricing or underpricing, undercharging compared to that. And third, like think about what the value proposition is and understand sort of like what is the actual value you're driving for the customer and make sure you're getting a good cut of that. And with these three frameworks, it helps you at least narrow in on what is sort of like an appropriate pricing point, at least as a starting point. And that's what I recommend to companies.
That makes sense. I've seen it in the non-SaaS space too. We deal with a lot of e-commerce, SEO, content marketers, stuff like that sell their businesses with us. And a common thing, whenever I meet an entrepreneur that's selling a service or something where they really do control the price, like an e-commerce, for example, I feel like they're always undercharging. And it's almost like this constant race to the bottom. And the most common advice I've been giving, at least over the last year, is like, yo, you should like conversion rate optimization, that price point, at least like every 6 months. If you're running ads to it, see what happens. The market changes, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of entrepreneurs are pretty resistant to that. Why do you think entrepreneurs are resistant to charging what in their head they think I'm definitely worth that, but I can't actually charge that? Like, what is that barrier that's stopping them?
I think it's just sort of like they're scared of somebody saying no, right? They're scared of rejection. Like many of us are scared of rejection. And so like I just think it's like one of those things of just like you got to get over it and just like push, right? And if they say no, like have a backup plan where it's like, all right, well then discount based on that, right? But always go higher, right? Like my view is like, you've hit your optimal pricing if when your customer complains, but they still pay. That means you've hit it. Like most of the time, like I've done this too, where it's like, oh, this is what we charge. And they're like, okay, great. You're like, damn it. Like it's just like, I know like I probably should have charged more. There's no pushback. You're like, yeah, okay, then you've clearly undercharging in my opinion.
Yeah, I like to call that positive price friction. Like
Yeah.
you want a little bit of pushback. You don't want to just like, yes, here it is. Because like, oh shit, you said like, did I just like throw myself into the basement? And that's going to hurt your growth.
Going to hurt your growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me a bit about why a founder should be super focused, or maybe you disagree with this, but why a founder should be more super focused on like a narrow target audience versus targeting everyone. Like to me as a marketer, I understand, but for our audience out there, like maybe they're running their first SaaS business and they're like, I'm going to build a CRM for everyone. Like, why
Yeah.
is this a bad idea?
Because you have to think about sort of like a lot of times markets are pretty saturated already. And so you have to think about the market. Like the analogy I was used is sort of like, it's like an armored suit, right? And so the market, like there's lots of big players, you have no brand name. And so it's like, it's this big armored suit. But the way that you get in is like, you get in with a very, very thin knife, right? And so you try to find these little chips in the market. And that chip is like the smallest, most niche customer segment that is underserved, that hopefully has money that's willing to pay for your product. And you go after that, right? The more narrow, the better. And then over time, you expand. Once you dominate that small, narrow, sort of like small niche, then you expand that niche over time, right? And then you kind of go, it's very similar to sort of like this awful sort of like analogy, but it's like the example, but it's like Facebook, right? They went after like Harvard students, and then they went after Ivy League students, and it went after like students in general, right? Like top 50 universities, and it went after every university student. Then they went after young adults. Then they kind of just expanded the pie over time. And that's kind of the same, like in general, like that principle is kind of the right principle in general, where yes, we want to see you own everybody in the long run, but it's sequencing, right? It's prioritization and sequencing.
I love that. And I see that often in my space. So I have a person who's looking to buy a content site from basically like a mini media company. And he wants to say do it in the kitchen niche. So I told him like, look, just buy a website that has broad enough branding. Like you shouldn't care if the only article on there is about blenders because you can always expand, but dominate
Yep.
that one market. And also in the service niche, it just makes your marketing so much easier. So I have a friend, he runs a marketing agency and he only targets one profession in the agency. And not just that, he targets one thing that profession sells. That's the only thing he'll do. And if they're like, oh, well, I have this other stuff, he's like, you'll have to find someone else. I don't do that. The only thing he does is that until he gets up to a certain point of scale where the fulfillment of his agency literally takes almost no time because he has all this data and creatives that you can just reuse over and over again. He's like turning his service into this productized assembly line. I feel like a lot of people get a bit, I don't know if depressed is the right word, if they are like going so narrow when they have this big vision, but like going narrow is actually what allows you, in my view,
Correct.
at least, to go really big fast.
It's super counterintuitive, right? Of just like going super niche where it's like, what? But I want to target everyone. It's like, yes, you can do that eventually, but you go super niche to grow. That's the irony. And this is where a lot of people are, no, I want to serve everybody, right? So this idea of sort of like shotgun versus sniper rifle. It's just like, I actually think a sniper rifle is way more accurate and just like way better, like way more effective, right? Like you think about the bang for the buck. It's like, if you don't have a lot of money, like it's different if you're like a VC funded company and you want to do the spray and pray, that's fine. That works. You can do that, but it's just wasteful, right? Like it's like the American way of war, just like bomb everything. It's like, no, you should just like sniper rifles, just so much more effective, right? That just works way better.
I love the analogies. I want to get into your investment side of what you're doing. But before we do, what are some of the common mistakes SaaS founders make in your view when they're really trying to scale and go big?
As you said, like just trying to do too much, like tackle too many segments, trying to try too many different sort of like marketing channels. It's like, no, like focus, right? And this is hard. I also think one of the things that's natural for a lot of founders is that when you're really, really smart, you kind of get bored very quickly and they're all smart. And it's just like, this is working now. And move on to next thing, next puzzle. It's like, well, the irony is just you want to double down on the stuff that works until it stops. Like have a very clear cutoff point. But a lot of times, like you haven't even saturated that cutoff point. You haven't even saturated that segment. And so it's like they get bored and then move on to the next thing. And this is something I see that chronically happens.
Yeah, I agree. One last thing on narrow audience. I was just trying to look it up. I couldn't find it, but I think it's Podio, the CRM management tool.
Oh, yeah, sure. Podio. Yeah, I know them.
I think they started off selling specifically to like dealerships. I want to say car dealerships. I don't know if that's right. I heard some stories, some very successful CRM. I think it was them. That was like their only niche. And now they're worth like $1 billion, something like that. And they expanded out there. I think niche targeting is like, you just breathe a sigh of relief. Like, hey, I know what I need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think like better to be king of your own little kingdom, right? And then you can expand that kingdom over time. That's way better, right? Like I think small is beautiful. I think people forget that sometimes.
I agree. So you've invested in over 400 pre-seed and seed stage startups.
Yeah, 452 investments as of now.
Oh my God. You are growing at a rapid pace. That is awesome. Congrats on all that. That's a huge amount of work and really cool. In terms of your criteria, when you are investing in someone, in a company, what are you looking for?
The basic things like it's probably 20-30% market business model. And it's mainly on the team, right? Like I think these folks are like super smart. Do I think like they have the grit and they're willing to grind through this? Are they missionaries versus mercenaries, right? Do they want to work on this for the next 10 years of their life, right? Regardless of whether I'm involved or not. Like I'm looking for these type of things. Is this a real problem they're trying to solve? Does the market actually make sense? It's like all the typical VC stuff that you hear, right? And read about, but like there's an art to this because even though it's just hard to understand people, right? Like the hardest thing is trying to figure out people most of the time because I'm pre-seed, it's super early. So you're usually not investing based on traction. A lot of times they don't even have a product. It's just like, how well did they understand the market? Like, have these people done their homework? Like how well are they positioned themselves? Have they thought about sort of how they compare against the competition and their go-to-market? Like just have they done their homework? And I'm continually surprised at how many founders have actually not done their homework.
That does not surprise me.
I'm not surprised. Nothing surprises me anymore, to be honest.
Entrepreneurs are like contained whirlwinds of chaos. They often don't know what's going on and where they're going. I am that way myself, so I can relate. I often joke that I am my own target market.
Yes, I get it, right? It's really hard and there's no science to this, right? Like this is why I think Silicon Valley is still very valuable because when you surround yourself with other entrepreneurs and founders, you learn by osmosis. And so when you're versus building it yourself, where you learn the hard way, right? It's like literally trial by fire.
So when you're looking to invest, how important is it that the problem they're trying to solve, that there is no competition in the market? Because I feel like this is another entrepreneur trap where they think like, oh God, there's a bajillion people in this space. I cannot do it. Or they see one person in the space like, oh, I guess it's taken. Like, what are your thoughts on that? How unique do you need to be considered, a worthwhile investment? Or do you need to be at all?
I like both, right? In general, where it's like, I like sort of like markets that are not very clear sometimes, but potentially could be big or confident will be big, just don't know the timing for it. And I also like markets where it's like, there is a lot to be said of a market that's full of competitors. Like that validates where it's like, okay, clearly there's a market there. Then it becomes a question of differentiation, right? Like, what are you doing differently? How do you think you're going to win in such a competitive market? And I want them to clearly have thought through this, right? Because like they're the ones, like my views, if I know the market better than them, then I'm like, wow, like this is a problem. Like I'm looking to learn from these founders, right? Like I'm assuming that they've done the homework. I'm assuming that they've really dug in and they've been thoughtful about this, where it's like, yeah, like I'm going after this market. Yes, there's lots of players in the CRM space, but here's the niche we're going after, or here's the angle we're targeting, and here's why we're going to win. Here's sort of like they've thought through, like obviously this isn't always going to work out, but it's like they've been very, very thoughtful about their approach. And so I've been convinced where a lot of times I'm like, yeah, this market's like, it's so crowded. And you meet this founder where it's like, yes, it is crowded, but like, here's how we're going to tackle it. Like, here's all the other players. Here's what they're doing right. Here's the stuff that they're doing crappy. And this is how we're going to win. We're going to go with this approach, target this customer. And here's why this makes sense. And you're like, yes, okay, great. Like I can be convinced, right? Like if it makes sense.
Yeah. So, what do you think about this? I call it like the better mousetrap and the hammer scenario. So, you come up with a better mousetrap, you have a better CRM, you're doing something that competition sucks at, but they have a lot more money than you. So, once they see you, they just build that feature themselves and basically hammer your mousetrap to smithereens. Is that something you see in more competitive spaces, or are these companies too slow to do that?
I do see that sometimes, but I would say it doesn't happen as often as a lot of founders think. Because the problem with a lot of these big companies is that they are just big, bloated, dumb, and slow. They have product roadmaps that they have to sort of like follow already. And so it's just a political battle to try to jam these new features in. So it takes longer than you think. And so that window that you have as a founder may actually be longer than you think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Their own bureaucracy gets in their way from stopping you from stealing market share, more or less.
And they usually implement very badly. Even if you implement, like they implement it very badly.
Is this why a lot of times the bigger companies out there are just like, screw it, I'm just going to acquire the better mousetrap, like Facebook and Instagram?
That is usually it. Like we just suck at this. Let's just buy them. Let's really just buy our competition.
Money solves the problem again. Just throw some more VC money that way, we'll be fine.
That's how I've gotten some of my exits in the past. So I am not complaining about it, right? Like that's a game and that's okay, right? That's okay.
That is awesome. So you've been in this crazy world for a while. Before we move on from your criteria, do you only invest in SaaS, or do you do e-commerce? Is there other business models that you're interested in?
I look at everything, but I do mainly SaaS and fintech and developer tools. This is where I've had my success in the past. So this is sort of where I'm doubling down.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like the focus. So, with your years and years of experience, do you think now is harder for someone to create a successful startup in the current climate, or do you think it's easier?
I think it's easier to start. I think it's harder to scale, right? Like I remember Andreessen Horowitz said this, like maybe many, many years ago. So it is way easier to start companies now. It's just harder to sort of like build big, massive breakout companies. But in general, I think it really depends on what your goals are. Where it's like if you're trying to build like these quote unquote like lifestyle niche software companies, it's so way easier now and generate like $100,000, $200,000 a year. I'm seeing lots of those, right? And so those aren't the stuff I'm funding, but I am seeing the growth of that space. And I love it. I love the fact that people are discovering entrepreneurship. And I think that's great for everybody. When you're fixing problems for these small niches, like there's so many problems out there, right? Like little small problems and people are willing to pay for it. I think it's amazing. And so I do think it's easier to start feasible companies. I think to get big, massive, multi-billion-dollar companies, I think it's so hard now, but I still think it's doable. In some ways it's easier because there's a lot more science out there. There's a lot more books. There's a lot more knowledge. There's a lot more people who've done this before, so you can get the mentorship. But just the actual execution of it, boy, so hard. And just the price you pay for it, it is doable. I think everybody and anybody can build a multi-billion-dollar company. The question is just sort of like whether they're willing to pay the price.
Yeah, there is a great
I'm not.
quote from,
I don't want to do it.
yeah, no, me neither. I'm more of the lifestyle guy than the
Yeah.
like growth at all costs kind of guy. Elon Musk's like ex-wife on Quora, she had a whole like awesome post with like
Oh yeah,
saying like,
great
I want to
post.
be a billionaire or something like that.
Amazing.
Yeah, you saw that?
Yeah, amazing.
I'll have to link to it in the show notes. But basically, she said like, yeah, you could do it if you sacrifice your soul for it. Like you just sacrifice your whole life, just be devoted to this one thing and be like absolutely and humanly obsessed. Which
Yeah.
makes sense. I mean, it's an insane goal. Speaking of the lifestyle stuff, this is kind of a funny story I think you'd appreciate. So I have a friend, he was making about 40, 50K a month from a software company, and he was sponsoring events with the software company. We were having some beers after the conference, and I found out like it's not really his software. He just had white labeled it, and he was so much better at marketing it that he was like basically the single reason why the software even existed still.
It's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, it's just a funny thing. Like, if you want a software company but don't want to build the software, just go find software engineers bad at marketing, I guess, and white label them.
Brilliant, man. I love that.
So, a good portion of startups you worked with are outside of the US. Are there any reason why that is? And are there any emerging international markets you think entrepreneurs should be looking to take advantage of?
I'm maximum bullish on like the CE region, like Central Eastern Europe, right? Like I look at these markets like Poland, like Ukraine still. I've invested in like 3 Ukrainian startups. Like I'm super bullish still. Like 2 of them I just did in the last like 6 months. Like they're growing like crazy still. And like they're just awesome, right? Like think about it. Like you're in the middle of a war zone and you're still building the business and growing the business. Like I want to support more of that, right? I've invested in lots of Russian founders, like not in the last 6 months, but I have in the past, and they're amazing. And all my Russian founders have left Russia for obvious reasons, right? And so I've invested in a lot of like companies from the region. Like I'm bullish, for example, like on Hungary. I'm bullish on like founders from like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic. Amazing. Like they work super hard. They're hungry, great technical talent. Armenia is super interesting too, right? Like I was just there last week, and just like there's some really, really interesting companies coming out of this region. So very bullish.
Yeah, I love it. I feel like my own area here in Southeast Asia, like it is such a renaissance of things that are happening over here. Maybe renaissance is the wrong word, but there's a emerging phase here, like especially in Vietnam. Like across the river from me, there's a guy that exited crypto exchange for around like $10 million. Like crypto's huge in Vietnam. Like
Yeah, yeah.
they start all the gaming cafes into crypto farming cafes.
Yep.
Which I think is brilliant. Tell me, are there any niches or industries that you see on the horizon that are super worth paying attention to? Anything that stands out?
I like anything, maybe this is my bias, like anything still in the creator space. I think anything sort of like developer tools are still like UC, right? Like just there's so much garbage, really, really garbage developer tools in general. I don't know if there's anything specific, to be honest, where ultimately I'm led by the founders, but like these are the spaces I really like a lot. Like I like developer tools. I like any sort of like these niche sort of like stuff that's focusing on the creator space, because the reality is that this is going to be the path for many people of entrepreneurship. And so any tools that actually enable that, particularly in the creator space, I am very interested in. And that's just my view.
Awesome, man. Before we get into rapid fire questions, like I feel like I have a bajillion more questions to ask you, so I will have to get you back on here. But
yeah, we'll do a part 2 if people find this interesting.
For sure. So before we get in the rapid fire section, what is your best professional advice you've ever been given or heard?
This idea of like learning versus earning, right? When I think back, like every time I went into something, this sounds stupid, but like every time I went into something just like because I thought I was going to make a lot of money in it, it never really worked out versus sort of like when I went into something sort of like really just for like the growth opportunity where I optimized for like working with like super smart, awesome people, working with like, and it's just where I knew like I was just going to learn a lot. I always did well. And maybe that's just me, like maybe that's just my personality, but just like I think early in your career you want to optimize for like learning over earning. Later on you can optimize for earning, but I do think in the beginning it's really more about like the learning aspect of it. If you do that, you just can't go wrong.
100%. I originally took this job. I was employee number 4 at EF. A lot of the audience knows, but I used to be an oil field roughneck up in Alaska, and I quit the oil field, took a massive pay cut to go write blog posts for EF. And I remember my boss in the oil field at the time, he's like congratulating me for getting to marketing because he knew I always had this passion for marketing. Yeah. And then he's like, so where are you moving to? You said you're moving out of Alaska. I'm like, yeah, I'm moving to Vietnam. He's like, Greg, is this real? I'm like, well, yeah. I'll find out.
Well, I would say the other thing, sort of assuming you're doing the sort of like the optimization for learning, optimizing for working with good people. The other thing, to be honest, is also when everyone's questioning you, you're probably making the right decision. Every decision that I made that was sort of like, everyone's like, what the hell are you doing? Like, why are you moving this place? Why are you take this role? Like, those guys are clowns. Why would you join that place? Always turned out to be a good decision.
I like that. It's the whole zig and zag thing. I think that's a very entrepreneurial trait, doing things that other people are like, you are absolutely crazy if you do that.
Yeah. And that means that you have massive upside, right? Like when I joined Yahoo, that was not that obvious, right? People were like, why would you join the like .com, like failing company? Like, why would you do that? Right? Like that turned out to be very lucrative for me personally.
That is awesome. All right. So let's move to the rapid fire questions. So answer these questions as quickly as you can. First thing that comes to your mind. Are you ready, my friend?
Yep.
All right. What are the best hidden growth opportunities in the SaaS world today?
In my opinion, like we talked about earlier, right? Like it's content, like own your own content, build your own content, become your own media. Like that's the only way that you can actually have sustainable growth, in my opinion.
100%. I agree. I'll have to send you my unfinished 8-part series on building a media empire that I taught our entrepreneurs a couple of years ago.
Oh, awesome. Oh, I love that. Oh my God, I love that. I'd pay for that.
I've been on that train for years. I actually do our own marketing. I try to do it as if we're a media company. So what tools or resources can SaaS founders use to grow their online business?
I found this one really interesting product. It's called Conversion Crimes. Such a good product.
We're good friends with the owner, Quinn. Her copywriters actually works for me.
It's a great product. That and the Wayback Machine, right? Like go back and check out like big sort of like SaaS companies and go look at what their website looked like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. You'll find it very insightful.
That is awesome. You brought up Quinn. I have to let her know. I'm a big fan of Convergent Crimes and what they're doing. I love their whole positioning and like brand identity that they're doing is really cool.
Yeah, great product.
So my final question and the absolute hardest question, what has been your funniest moments since starting working in the VC and PE world?
I would say the funniest moments are just like all the stupid things I did, right? Of just like how wrong I was on like certain investments where it's just like, this thing's never going to work. And then you find it like 5 years later on where it's like, wow, like, boy, was I wrong on that one, right? Like just all the time. I just think like there's this great saying in Silicon Valley where it's like investors, right? There are humble investors and there will be investors that will be humble. And it's just like, it's such a humbling business, right? Because like you think VCs know what they're doing. They don't. Like nobody knows anything, right? Or nobody knows nothing is probably the better quote, I think, from Hollywood. It's like nobody knows nothing. And just like this joke that we think we know everything, like we're wrong like all the time. And just we're continually humbled where it's like you see these businesses where it's like, wow, like I totally wrote this business off and I was totally wrong, right? Like just got it completely wrong. Like you just laugh at yourself. You have to laugh at yourself all the time.
Oh, I love it. It reminds me of even like simple things like CRO tests. Like people think they always know what works. And I don't know what works. That's why I always tell people to test it.
You're learning all the time. That's why you have to test it.
I've annoyed so many B2B influencers when they're talking about gated content by just saying you should test it. And they get like really mad at me. Like, you can't test it. Like, what do you mean you can't test it? There's plenty of tools to test it.
Yeah. You can test almost everything and anything, right? And so the scientific method is great, right? You have a hypothesis and your hypothesis, this is going to work or not. And then you test it, right? The market always tells you and the market always fools you, right? Like you think you know the market, you don't know the market.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. I've loved this conversation. Marvin, where can people find you if they want to connect with you with everything that you're doing?
LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter at Marvin Liao, and I also have a newsletter. It's like hardfork.substack.com. So these are probably the ways to find me.
Awesome. We'll put your links in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on, man.
No, thanks for having me, man. It's so much fun. I wish we could do this live over drinks, man. Like, we'll have to do that next time you're in SF. We keep on crossing each other.
Tell you what, next time I'm in San Francisco, we'll get some beers in the Tenderloin and make it really interesting.
Maybe not in Tenderloin. Maybe you come to my neighborhood.
If you're ever in Asia, we'll do the same thing in a nicer neighborhood of Bangkok or Ho Chi Minh City as well.
I look forward to that.
Awesome, man. There you have it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it got you inspired at all the different things that are happening in this industry. And of course, if you just want to buy a highly profitable business, you can always go to empireflippers.com/marketplace, or maybe you want to make an exit of your highly profitable business, and you could go to empireflippers.com/sell your site. I've been your host, Greg. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you leave a review, give us a like, a follow, share it across social media. Talk to you all soon. See you on the next episode.